while there are some downsides to the way that globalization has happened, going to the opposite situation where it's every country for themselves, it erodes a lot of the institutions that keep us from turning to things like global wars, which would be devastating for the economy, but would also be devastating for life on this planet. I am concerned that both political parties right now in the United States feel that they need to take this protectionist turn. I understand why they feel that way. I will be the first to admit that there are people throughout the United States who have been harmed by globalization.
This is Maestro Minute, the show that discusses all things real estate, sharing interviews with the most successful people in the industry. Hear from their perspective and what they are doing to achieve success. Get exclusive tips on how you can also succeed in real estate. Maestro Minute is brought to you by Maestro Development. Here's your host, Nareg Muradian.
So let's get out of the U.S. a little bit. Globalization. I feel like the demands of what's happening in the world, right? A lot of dynamic things happening. You could talk about the wars. You could talk about supply. You could talk about supply chain, all that stuff. But what's the overall pressures on the U.S. economy as it relates to what's happening globally? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, we've talked a good bit about the Federal Reserve, so let's start there. I think one of the challenges that the Federal Reserve faces is that their job is to respond to the needs of the American economy. But what they do affects everybody. So these high interest rates that we've had for the last few years haven't just hurt Americans. They have hurt a lot of economies around the world. And so it's a delicate ethical and moral dilemma. If you're a Fed policymaker, to what extent do you make decisions because they're going to harm people who aren't really your constituents, right? It's not technically your problem, but deep down you should care about those ramifications. And I don't know how they do that calculus in their head, but that is one thing that I've been concerned about for a while. Now, at the same time that all that is happening, we've got a lot of Wall Street, and not just in America, but also China and other countries with a lot of money to investing around the world in developing nations. And those emerging markets have been accumulating a lot of debt. So emerging market debt has gotten to the point where I believe that a lot of countries are over-leveraged. And so we talked earlier about what kind of risks should we be concerned about could lead to another recession, or at least could cause some weakening economic growth that the Fed will have to respond to. I think the next big problems to occur are more likely to be overseas than in the United States.
Will that have an impact on us here?
Absolutely, yeah.
How so?
And it depends which country it is, because some countries we have stronger trade relationships with than others.
So it's trade impacts.
So it all depends on its trade and its capital flows. Right? If we've invested a bunch of money in certain countries and they start defaulting, that's going to be losses that's going to show up on our banks' balance sheets. And one of the things that I think is, when we look back on this time in history, we're going to wonder about is, why did we invest in all of these countries with such low interest rates? At a time when we're raising interest rates at home and we're so concerned about credit risk, we've been offering bonds to other countries, or we've been buying bonds from other countries at surprisingly low interest rates. I mean, the spread that's supposed to compensate investors for that exchange risk, for that emerging market risk, has been surprisingly low over recent years. And that's what allowed them to issue all that debt, because they know that they're paying us relatively low interest rates, compared to other investments throughout the world. That is a concern that I really have going forward.
So America, free capital market, capitalism, democracy, are they connected? Like you see China, it's not a free market, right? Russia, it's not a free market. Like, talk a little bit about democracy and capitalism and how they tie together.
Yeah. One of the things about both of those ideas is, I think oftentimes we fail to really explore how much of a spectrum it is. We think about, well, we have a capitalist economy. China has a communist economy. We go around the world and we label these countries. They all exist on a spectrum, right? We have a capitalist economy? What does that mean? It could mean a lot of different things, but if we mean free markets, We don't have a free market. We just talked about all the regulations that you have to follow in order to get anything done in the real estate market, right?
Yeah.
This is not a free market by any stretch of the imagination. And the government is a huge portion of the economy, right? A huge percentage of Americans get their income through one way or another from the government. That makes it not a free market, right? It is more free market than China,
Correct.
sure, but it's on a spectrum. And so I think one of the mistakes that we might make when we oversimplify this conversation is to look at a country that's all the way on the communist end of the spectrum and say, well, that's not working. And it's not, right? We've seen countries that have been fully communist and it has not turned out well for them. We then say, well, then we should go all the way to the other end of the spectrum. Well, now, wait a second. That's not necessarily true either. Another example we could use that's maybe working in the opposite direction is Russia. You know, one of the economists who inspired me to go into the field was Joe Stiglitz. He was a Nobel Prize winner for studying. He was one of the founders of the field of information economics. He really wanted to study situations where people are involved in a capitalist transaction, but for some reason, they don't have access to all the information they need. And so somebody's going to get screwed.
Right.
And he found that there's a lot of those situations out there, and that those situations make the economy underperform and make a lot of people get hurt. So he was really frustrated when he became chief economist of the World Bank in the 1990s. And he watched some of the transition as Russia went from a communist country coming out of the Soviet Union to a capitalist country, because he felt like all of the things that he had learned in his career were completely ignored. The people at the World Bank at the time were encouraging Russia to go as fast as they could in the direction of capitalism, which in the long run may not be a bad thing. But for a country that doesn't have the democratic institutions in place to make sure that when you have a free market, it's governed effectively so that people aren't taken advantage of because they don't have the right information. If you don't have those institutions in place, instead of having a well-operating free market, you have a place where a few oligarchs take over and take advantage of everybody because there aren't the right regulations in place. Yeah. And so to this day, Russia is a fraction of the economy that it could be if it had more democratic institutions in place. I would say that nowadays, the best scholar, the best economist of the study of democracy and economic growth is an economist named Darren Acemoglu up at MIT. And he'll win a Nobel Prize for sure someday. And a lot of his work has been studying, as countries adopt more democratic institutions, does it foster economic growth? This has been an old debate that people have been studying for decades, but he's brought some new data to it, and I think has been really careful about measuring it to make sure that he's actually identifying cause and effect properly. And the answer is yes. Democratic institutions do, on average, improve economic growth. And it's not just because they move you more in a capitalist direction. They don't always do that per se. It's because they ensure that when capitalism is in effect, the growth is widespread, people feel that they're benefiting, and that supports the capitalist institutions.
Yeah.
One of his current fears that he's been talking about just over the last year or two, after spending a lifetime studying this stuff, is that in places like the United States and places in Western Europe where we've had very robust democratic institutions, he sees a lot of those institutions under attack now. And what'll happen is, as people don't feel that capitalism has benefited them, they will erode the very democratic institutions that are designed to try to protect them and make sure that capitalism does work for them. If we erode our democratic institutions, fewer and fewer people will benefit from capitalism.
It goes back to the more of a monopoly and oligarchy.
Right.
Lastly, I feel like there's a trend with these, all the countries are becoming more nationalistic, right?
Yeah.
Less global.
Yeah.
But ultimately, we're all tied together globally.
Yeah.
So as these countries kind of condense and become more nationalistic and cut their ties with other countries, right? You see that a lot with the elections that are happening in different countries. How do you see the economy being affected by that?
Well, it's not good for the economy, but it's also not good for foreign relations. I mean, let's just be clear that while there are some downsides to the way that globalization has happened, Going to the opposite situation where it's every country for themselves, it erodes a lot of the institutions that keep us from turning to things like global wars, which would be devastating for the economy, but would also be devastating for life on this planet. I am concerned that both political parties right now in the United States feel that they need to take this protectionist turn. I understand why they feel that way. I will be the first to admit that there are people throughout the United States who have been harmed by globalization. They took a job that at the time made sense, but then 10 or 20 or 30 years later, when they were midway through their careers, they suddenly found that that job was outsourced, and that wasn't their fault. And there was no new plan put in place to help them make the transition.
Right.
I often feel like one of the problems that we have in economics is that we are good at identifying what's the goal we need to get to, but we're terrible at figuring out the transition to get there. We know that having a more globalized world where we all work together would be better for everybody. But along the way, there's going to be winners and losers, and somehow we forgot about the losers. We did the transition terribly. As a result, we decided to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Instead of coming up with better ways to manage globalization, to make sure that people are prepared to thrive in a globalized economy. They have the right education, they have the right job training, they live near the jobs that they can thrive in, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Instead of doing those things, which frankly is the harder work of being a policymaker, we're taking what feels like the easier way out, which is, screw it, we just won't be a part of the global economy. That's not going to be good for anybody in the long run.
It's not going to be good because we are tied together, I agree. And would you say that even though there's an election coming up, how much of that's going to have an impact of the economy in the U.S.?
Will the election have an effect on the economy?
Right.
Oh, it definitely will. The policies that the two parties are offering are very different. I saw Larry Summers, the famous economist, argue just a couple of days ago that he was worried when he saw Donald Trump's latest economic policies because he felt that they were the most inflationary policy proposals he's seen in his lifetime. And what he was talking about was you institute a ton of tariffs and you drive up the cost of everything that everybody buys. You instigate more global warfare. You drive up oil prices and so on and so forth. I think there's an argument to be made that there are problems with some of President Biden's policies too, but he's trying to make that distinction that whoever you vote for here, they're going on very different paths, right? So Donald Trump, for example, wants far more tariffs. Some of his economic advisors have floated the idea of entirely replacing the income tax with just tariffs, which I don't know any economist who would support that idea. At the same time, the income tax system is poised to change, and so it's going to be up to which of these two presidents is going to get to see that, because the TCJA, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act from 2017, has a whole bunch of provisions that expire soon. Those provisions are primarily the individual income taxes. So the tax cuts that we saw in 2017 are going to go away unless Congress institutes a new series of reforms to either keep them in place or change them somehow and not just let them disappear. The two parties have very different ideas about how to do that. Donald Trump and the Republicans pretty much just want to, because they were the ones who passed it in the first place, they just want to reinstate it, keep it permanent. President Biden and the Democrats, they have their ideas about how to let some of them expire, mostly for the very wealthy, and let some of them stay in place for the middle class. And if you're worried about the budget deficit, that's going to have very different implications, right? President Biden's approach would raise more revenue. Donald Trump's approach would raise less. So depending on where you fall on the political spectrum, you can take your pick there, but they are very different sets of policies.
Yeah, no, great summary. Last question, mid-year, where do you see us heading economically in the next year and a half?
Right now, things look good. I don't think that we're headed for any real problems over the summer, certainly. It's always harder to see further beyond that. I think that President Biden is going to do everything in his power to make sure that the economy is humming along by November. I think that the economy is going to be one of the primary determinants of whether he gets reelected or not. And not just the economy, I would specifically say gas prices. I did some research years ago where we showed just how important oil prices and gas prices are to predicting election outcomes. And we found some evidence that presidents are pretty good at keeping gas prices low right before the election so that there's nothing upsetting people when they go to the pump. But that's harder to do at a time when you have war going on in the Middle East and in Russia, two of the major places where they can control gas and oil prices.
Right.
So I think that's going to be one of the things that we've got to keep our eyes on. And then, like I said, I would keep my eyes on, I always, just as a general rule for everyone out there, when I'm looking for where is the next big crisis going to come, I'm always looking for who's taking on too much debt. Because time and time again, since we've had capitalism for the last couple of 100 years, the worst recessions have always been caused by over-leverage. And even when things get a little out of whack and prices get a little too high, if people haven't taken on too much debt, there are ways to unwind those problems without it spilling over and causing a massive financial crisis. When it spills over into the banking sector, as we saw in 2008, is when we're really in trouble. So that's why I'm worried about that happening overseas. But in general, over-leverage is the real culprit that I worry about.
Thanks for tuning in to the Maestro Minute Podcast. Make sure to rate this podcast if you found it helpful, share it with a friend that could use it, and follow us on all major podcast platforms. The Maestro Minute, powered by Maestro Development.